Middle Ages, feudal system 800 AD to 1600 AD. The basic government and society in Europe during the Middle Ages was based around the feudal system. Small communities were formed around the local lord and the manor. The lord owned the land and everything in it. He would keep the peasants safe in return for their service. The lord in return would provide the king with soldiers or taxes. Service for land. Under the feudal system, land was granted to people for service. It started at the top with the king granting his land to a baron for soldiers, all the way down to a peasant getting land to grow crops. The manor. The center of life in the Middle Ages was the manor. The manor was run by the local lord. He lived in a large house or castle where people would gather for celebrations or for protection if they were attacked. A small village would form around the castle, which would include the local church. Farms would then spread out from there, which would be worked by the peasants. Hierarchy of rulers. King. The top leader in the land was the king. The king could not control all of the land by himself, so he divided it up among the barons. In return, the barons pledged their loyalty and soldiers to the king. When a king died, his firstborn son would inherit the throne. When one family stayed in power for a long time, this was called a dynasty. Bishop. The bishop was the top church leader in the kingdom and managed an area called a diocese. The Catholic Church was very powerful in most parts of medieval Europe, and this made the bishop powerful as well. Not only that, but the church received a tithe of 10% from all the people. This made some bishops very rich. Baron. Barons ruled large areas of land called fiefs. They reported directly to the king and were very powerful. They divided up their land among lords who ran individual manors. Their job was to maintain an army that was at the king's service. If they did not have an army, sometimes they would pay the king a tax instead. This tax was called shield money. Lord, knight. The lords ran the local manors. They also were the knights and could be called into battle at any moment by their baron. The lords owned everything on their land, including the peasants, crops, and village. Peasants or serfs. Most of the people living in the Middle Ages were peasants. They had a hard, rough life. Some peasants were considered free and could own their own businesses like carpenters, bakers, and blacksmiths. Others were more like slaves. They owned nothing and were pledged to their local lord. They worked long days, 6 days a week, and often barely had enough food to survive. Fun facts about the Middle Age feudal system. Around 90% of the people worked the land as peasants. Peasants worked hard and died young. Most were dead before they reached 30 years old. The kings believed they were given the right to rule by God. This was called divine right. Lords and barons swore oaths of homage and fealty to their kings. The lord held absolute power over the fief or manor, including holding court and deciding punishments for crimes. Life in the town. Not all people lived in manors, castles, or monasteries. Many people lived in towns. Peasants looked for freedom, younger sons of noblemen hoped to make a fortune, and scholars looked for new ideas. They all left the country and traveled to the towns. The growth of towns. A medieval town had walls around it and narrow, crowded streets with rough wooden houses built close to each other. In some places, the sun could barely shine down on the streets, but it was these unattractive, uncomfortable towns that became centers of trade and art. After the Western Roman Empire fell, towns nearly disappeared from Europe. The population of Rome, the largest city in Europe, dropped from 1 million to only a few thousand. Trade was mostly done by barter, exchanging goods for other goods or services instead of using money. A shoemaker might exchange a pair of shoes he made for 3 chickens from the farmer without any money being paid. But in the 1000 AD, trade and town life began to come back. From Italy came linen, cloth made from a waxy plant. From northern France came woven wool, and leather came from Spain. And the craftspeople who made these products found ways to control their trades in order to make more money, gain power, and guarantee excellent quality. Guilds. Trades such as shoemakers, tailors, weavers, blacksmiths, and bakers organized to form guilds. Today we would call them unions. A guild was a union of people who practiced a trade. Guilds limited the number of people who could practice that trade. The system, called feudalism, had one lord over a castle and all the land around it. The lord controlled all the people too, but when towns grew, merchants and workers looked to each other for what they needed instead of the lord. After William the Conqueror's death in 1087, his Norman followers, with large estates, grew more and more powerful. They gained their wealth from payments, taxes, they demanded from towns that spread out on their land. Over several generations, the lord's power and wealth grew tremendously. When William's great-great-grandson John became King of England in 1199, he discovered that the most powerful landowners didn't like him and were eager to tell him. These are some of the reasons they didn't like him. John led England into several wars which he lost. He raised higher and higher levels of taxes. In 1204, John lost all of the lands he had inherited in the north of France to the King of France. This angered the English lords who held large estates in France. Also, there was a disagreement between John and the Pope which caused the churches to shut their doors to the people of England. Since the church controlled baptisms, marriages, worship, confession of sins, and funerals, many people were very angry with John. As a result, many lords refused to remain loyal to John. A small group of noblemen cornered him in a meadow outside of London. In June of 1215, after days of argument, they forced King John to agree to sign an amazing medieval document, the Magna Carta, or Great Charter. The Magna Carta guaranteed the rights of nobles, rights that a king could not take away. Free men to travel wherever they wish. Church completely free from king. All free men to be tried or sent to prison only by the courts. Fair taxes and treatment. The Magna Carta paves the way. Magna Carta, the king and nobles must respect the law. English Parliament. Parliament would meet regularly to advise the king on laws and taxes, and it would have the power to replace the king. English Bill of Rights. Parliament alone had the power to make laws and levy taxes. Declaration of Independence. The people have the right to overthrow an unjust government and replace it with a new government. By requiring the king to obey the law, the Magna Carta set down on paper the ideas of personal liberty and freedom. Many countries today have copied what the English lords did nearly 800 years ago. From the Magna Carta, Americans created the Bill of Rights in 1789 and included the idea of due process of law, which means that those who are accused of doing wrong get a fair trial in court.